Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. My name is Sean, and I'm delighted you're joining us for today's ESPC community webinar. Today I'm joined by Agnes Bartninkas, MVP, who will cover Error Mixology, crafting resilient cloud flows with Power Automate. We love hearing what you guys have to say, so remember to join in the conversation and about today's webinar. Our handle is at ESPC_community, and our hashtag is hashtag ESPC25. Tweet us, tag us, and tell us what you learned. Don't let the learning stop here. Check out our Learning Hub, which is updated with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. You can access and view the Learning Hub by visiting our website, sharepointeurope.com, and clicking the Content tab at the top. Continue to keep up and stay ahead by joining us for our next webinar, Exploring Dynamics 365 Sales for Business Central Users, with Andrew Bibby, MVP. This webinar will take place Thursday, 30th January, 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. CET. For more information on this webinar, please check out www.sharepointeurope.com/register for webinars. Elevate your Microsoft Power Platform skills at the European Power Platform Conference in Vienna on 16 to 19 June 2025. Power Platform Week attendees get €150 off tickets with code Power Platform Week, valid until February 7th. Learn the latest in Power Apps, Power Automate, and Dynamics 365 while connecting with experts and peers. Scan the QR code to register now or visit www.sharepointeurope.com/European Power Platform Conference. Don't miss our 2-for-1 sale for Falcon Europe, available February 5th only. Register now to get 2 participants for the price of 1. More perspectives, more networking, and more opportunities. Act fast. This offer is for 1 day only at www.sharepointeurope.com/Falcon Europe 2-for-1 deal. Ready to sharpen your skills or make the career-defining move? Join us at ESPC 25 to learn from 100+ experts across 120+ sessions, covering everything you need to know to stay ahead in Microsoft 365, SharePoint, Microsoft Teams, and Copilot. Get your tickets at www.sharepointeurope.com/pricing. After this webinar, we'll have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you might have into the questions box. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Center, where you'll be notified by email when it is available. And now, I'm going to pass you over to today's webinar presenter, Agnes. Hello, Agnes. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me. Give me a sec. I'll just share my screen.
Yeah, I can see your screen there.
Awesome, thanks. So, hi everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar. My name is Agnes, and I'm here to talk about how to build your Power Automate cloud flows in a way that makes them more resilient and robust. So before we delve into the topic itself, just a very quick intro into myself. So as mentioned, my name is Agnes. I run an agency that specializes in process improvement and automation. I'm a very experienced Power Automate developer and consultant and solution architect. And since last year, I'm also a Microsoft Business Applications MVP, specifically in the area of Power Automate. Share lots of info about Power Automate on LinkedIn. So if you don't follow me yet, but are interested in Power Automate, feel free to check it out. Right, and now the topic for today, as mentioned, is error handling or exception handling in Power Automate cloud flows. And the agenda is fairly straightforward. I'll just go through a few slides where I cover the basics. And then we'll switch to a few demos where I show you what that actually looks like in practice. Then we'll just wrap it up with some key takeaways and can do the Q&A at the end. Right, so the reason I talk about error handling in general is because, well, no matter how much time and effort you actually put into building your flows, regardless of what tool you use, unexpected things can and will happen. Now, what we don't want is those unexpected things to wreak havoc in our enterprise environment. But with Power Automate being marketed as a tool that's heavily focused on business developers or citizen developers or whatever you want to call them, basically people who do not come from an IT background. And it just happens that there is lots of users who simply do not know how to put in proper exception handling into their flows, or that they need to do it, in at all. And that's why we end up with lots of flows where there is no error handling, because that's the default thing. That's the default we get. There's no single template or framework or something like that coming officially or unofficially for how to actually build resilient and robust cloud flows. There's plenty of recommendations, but they might differ from the person who actually created them. So there is lots of things to know, and if you don't actively follow these news, you may not even be aware that your flows are simply have the potential of very easily failing. Now, before we actually go into the ways in which we would normally recommend handling errors, there's the one major step and the basic cornerstone of exception handling in cloud flows, and that's the so-called run after settings. So what this means is basically that whenever we want to handle any exceptions, we actually need to set the rules of them and the actions that follow the actions that we want to handle. By default, these settings are available on all actions, and by default, they're set to only the is successful setting, meaning that every action by default in a flow only executes if the previous action succeeded. And that's the normal setting. And what it basically means that if there is an error in your flow, if a certain action fails, further actions will simply not be executed. And if we want to put in any kind of exception handling, what we need to do first is, well, we'll obviously need some extra actions that will do the handling itself. But we will first need to set them up so that they actually only run when the previous actions, those that we want to handle, have either timed out or failed, basically, so that we only execute the exception handling bit of our flow if there is an exception to be handled. Right. And now that we've got that out of the way, there are essentially three ways in which we would normally handle errors in Power Automate Cloud Flows, right? So there is the no error handling approach, right? So that's the default thing that we all do when we start with Power Automate. We essentially just build out our flow without thinking about error handling, and we rely on the default rules in there. So there might be some retry policies by default applied to some actions, but other than that, if an action fails, the whole flow will fail. And that's obviously not recommended. So now that you know better, don't do it. The slightly better approach is the so-called action level error handling, which essentially means that we would handle or build rules to handle potential exceptions in every single action that is in our flow, or at least those that we think could fail and we want to handle. Now, because exception handling is based on this run after settings, and because it actually requires adding extra steps into our flow that would do the handling, this could very easily lead into even the simplest of flows becoming large and complex structures that are very difficult to read, because we'd be adding parallel branches after every single step in our flow for the handling bit. So yeah, again, not really recommended, even though slightly better than no handling at all. And the actually recommended approach is the use of containers. Containers are basically actions that can contain other actions inside them. That's why they're called containers. And there's three categories of them. There's the scope, there's the conditions, the normal condition and the switch, and the loops, a couple of them as well. So these all of these actions are basically containers. They can contain other actions inside them. And what when they actually do this, we can actually use them as a single large construct, and we can apply error handling to the entire container, meaning that if any of the actions inside the container fails, our error handling rules would then kick in. because the container then also failed, and that's what kickstarts the error handling, and that's a much more easily implemented and maintained approach, because, well, it leaves our flows much cleaner, and it also means that we're basically, it's much easier to build, less time consuming, and much easier to read them and understand them. Now, once we actually implement this bit where we actually handle the errors, where we have the rule to do something when a previous action fails, the do something bit is the next step, right? So we need to do something about that error. So we usually would, as a first step, try to fetch the actual error message so we then can use it for something like logging or reporting it somewhere. And now the way to do it is basically by fetching the outputs of the action that failed. And there's a couple of ways to do it, but in Power Automate, it's always the expressions, right? We have to use the expressions that are available in Power Automate, and there is a couple of them that we could use depending on the approach in error handling that we take. So if we go with the not recommended action level error handling approach, we could use the actions expression, and it would fetch the outputs of a single action. And the outputs would look like something like this, right? So that's a JSON object basically containing a status code, the headers of the action, and the body. That's always the same. Well, at least the fact it's a JSON object is always the same for every single action. That's the way actions work in Power Automate. It's basically an API response. But the structure of them will obviously differ per connectors and per actions, obviously. Right, but if we go with the recommended approach of using containers, there's another expression that we could use, and that's called result. So what we do there, is we use the result expression on a container, and it would fetch the outputs of all actions inside that container. They would also look like this, but since there's multiple actions inside a container, it would actually be in an array. So it would be an array of objects like this. And that means that we just kind of need to parse them slightly differently depending on which of these we actually use. Now, the not so cool thing about this approach is the fact that the schema, or basically the body, and in which way the body is actually returned by an action, basically differs very much between connectors. And that's basically because it just depends on who developed the connector and on their idea of how to actually return the body, especially in terms of error messages. So, well, and there's a shout out that is due here to David Wyatt, who actually came up with this and found these initially, and I found this on his blog a while ago. But basically, he listed 3 types of different schemas for how the error message might be returned in the body of an action. The first 3. So they could be basically, depending on the connector or the action used, they could be provided differently. When I was testing these, I couldn't really reproduce type 3, but I found a different one, type 4. That's even different from what he had found, and it just means that these are also not really static. They could potentially change, not only as new connectors are being published, but also potentially even existing connectors when they're updated. So it's not very static, and it really can get complex to be able to actually parse the JSON body of the outputs of the different actions if we want to fetch the message properly. Now, on top of that, on top of the fact that parsing it is not really fun, while using result in scopes or other containers is much better than using the actions expression on individual actions, it's not really all fine and dandy with this approach either. First of all, it only applies to the actual parent container. So if there is nested containers, for example, if you've got a scope like this, and inside that scope, if you've got a loop or a condition or something like that, you won't be able to fetch the actual outputs of that nested container if you just target this main scope. Because the outputs of that container, the nested container, will just say something like, well, assuming that an action actually failed inside it, would just say something like an action has failed and no dependent actions have been executed. So that's the generic exception for a container, basically, when an action inside it fails. And the result expression does not actually parse nested containers. So if we actually go with this approach and we handle containers, we have basically two choices. You either need to avoid nested containers, so basically not use them, or just kind of split them up, or use expressions to avoid conditions and so on. Or we have to build in a larger result expression that actually targets multiple containers, essentially every single container in our flow, so that we can actually fetch the message properly. And on top of that, loops have a completely different schema from conditions and scopes. So yeah, definitely not very fun to parse those results. So initially, what I would do in the past, a couple of years ago, was that I'd use the coalesce expression to basically pass in all of the different schemas and all of the different containers into it and try to parse it all. And it would be huge, and it would not necessarily cover all expressions because of the reasons mentioned previously. But then at some point, when I was delivering an earlier version of this specific session, someone in the audience actually told me about a different approach, and that included using XPath. And then I tried it out, and that's actually a great idea. So I had to update the whole thing. Basically, what it means is that if we actually convert the result to an XML object, we can use XPath, and the XPath then can use, we can use a sort of a specific XPath string or expression to just kind of fetch any message nodes inside the entire body. And then we don't need to rely on the different schemas. We don't really care about the different schemas anymore. So I tried it out. It looked cool, and initially the expression actually looked much nicer than this. Unfortunately, over time, it had to be, made even more complex, because I would find additional loopholes. So normally we need to obviously, skip actions or ignore the results of actions that were skipped because of them being in a parallel branch in a condition that did not get executed, or just being skipped because a previous action has failed and so on. So that was normal, right? Fine. But then at some point, while working on a project for a client, I actually found that there was one very specific connector that would actually return the message node with a capital M. Obviously, XPath is case sensitive, so it would get ignored. So I then added this ugly blob over here that actually translates all capital letters just in case to lowercase letters. And then this actually works. Haven't found an issue with this for quite a while now. Don't remember how long I've been using this for, but it actually always fetches the expression, the error message actually. Now, the still kind of a problematic thing about it is that we still need to target each individual container when we create the XML object. So normally it could look like this if you only have one, but if you have more, you would actually need a larger expression over here. I'll show you what that looks like in practice, which is actually just about now. So I'll switch to a demo. Give me a sec. Right, and before I actually show you the flows, just got a quick note. I generally don't like building flows that do nothing, even if it's for a relatively dry topic like error handling in flows, right? I usually add a personal touch. So for this specific session, for these specific demos, I actually use a relatively new passion of mine, which is making cocktails for myself and my friends. So basically, I've got this list on SharePoint where I've got a bunch of cocktail recipes. Those I've tried and made and liked, and some I didn't like, but still had them in this whole thing so that I basically have some tracking. And then I've built a solution in Power Automate with a few simple flows that would basically recommend some cocktails for myself based on what I like and also based on the ingredients I have available, which is in a different list, right? So basically this SharePoint list has a cocktail recipe with the ingredients needed, which are lookups to the ingredients list. And in the list in there, I actually track how much I actually have in stock at the moment, whether or not I can actually make a cocktail at home. So I've made this, and I've got a few different flows for the different approaches that I'm gonna actually show you what they actually would look like. Right, and the first one is probably the most popular that you may have heard of if you come from an IT background or in any sort of programming, or maybe even RPA or something like that. That's the try, catch, and finally approach. So it basically means that we have a try block, which is the normal actions of the flow. We then have a catch block that is supposed to catch any errors in the try. If try fails, then the catch runs. And then we have a finally block at the very end that basically executes regardless of whether try has failed or succeeded. In this particular case, what it does is basically it gets me some cocktail recipes that are my favorites. And then it would, do a select and send me the recommendations of what to make via email. Now, the way to set this up in the try, catch, finally approach is basically we need to make the catch only run if try has failed or timed out. So that's where we use the run after settings, right? And then we need to set up finally to run if catch was successful or skipped, because if try fails, catch will run, and then if it's successful, we need to run finally. If try doesn't fail, catch doesn't run, but we still need to run finally, so we need to run if catch was skipped. And that's it. It's fairly straightforward. Now, I personally do not like this approach because of a couple of reasons. First of all, I find it very rare in actual business scenarios that I would want something to happen regardless of whether previous actions failed or not. Usually, whatever is in here would actually be different depending on whether it failed or succeeded. And even in this case, that's the case as well. I actually had to build in this funky expression that actually checks whether or not the previous actions failed, so that I don't attempt to send an email that also fails afterwards. So that's extra additional logic just to handle the possibility of this failing. And then in addition to that, I cannot actually stop this flow with an error, because it will always kind of complete successfully as long as the email actually succeeds, because there's no terminate action at the end. And when catch actually kicks in, if these actions succeed and if they complete, then the whole flow is considered as a success. And so in the flow runs, it will actually show up as a successful run, even though this failed. And that's not something I would personally like. That screws up any monitoring and any potential logging if we use the default functionalities in the Power Platform. So I could add a terminate action in here to terminate with an error, but then I would again need extra logic to make the terminate only execute, or only execute with a failure status if these actions fail. So that's again extra complexity that isn't really necessary, in my opinion. I can't put it in here because then finally will not execute. So again, doesn't really make much sense. But that's why I don't like it, and I don't really use it at all. I just wanted to demo it just because it's a it's somehow a relatively popular approach when you start with it. But then probably when you realize that it doesn't really work for your business cases, then you stop using it. But there's a couple of things that will also be the same in the other flows as well, that are also some important when it comes to actually handling those exceptions, right? So the first thing in my catch is composing the XML, right? So that's something I actually already showed you in the slide. So basically composes the XML based on the results of try. And then I'll run a child flow that would parse the error. So that's the bit where I use that funky expat expression. So I have this is in a child flow because I can then reuse it across flows. I don't need to actually create that action and that functionality in every single flow. I can't really put this compose out into a child flow because, well, first of all, the result will only be available within this flow, and the actual expression may differ depending on how many containers I have. So if I have more, if I have any nested containers and so on, I actually going to need to do this bit over here, unfortunately, and then pass it on to a child flow that can then parse it. Child flow would then be very simple. It will just have an input field for the actual result, and then it will do the expat bit with the big ugly expression to actually fetch it and respond with the error message. And then do something with it afterwards. You can send an email, you can send it via Teams message or a Slack channel or whatever, or just log it somewhere. So I'll show you a few different approaches in the different flows. In this case, this would just send me an email if I ran it. And then another email if regardless of whether this was successful or not, it would it would just send me the recommendations with a different text. And then basically what it would show up as is successful regardless of whether or not the actions inside it failed. And that's the thing I hate the most about these things. And then just one last thing I actually forgot to mention in it is the use of a flow run URL, right? So this URL is something you can actually build very easily via using the workflow expressions, and what it will generate is a direct URL to the specific flow run. And it's recommended to include that in any log messages or reports whenever you send them out, because it makes it much easier to actually find the specific flow run that had an error in. Even if it looks as successful in the flow run history, you can still use that URL to find it easier. And it actually has a longer retention span. And on top of that, it also is available and accessible to environment admins, even if they don't have access, or if the flow wasn't shared with them. So very useful and very much recommended. I usually initialize it at the very beginning of the flow as a variable, and then use that variable in any log messages and any reports and so on. Right. Now, the approach I actually prefer is a slightly simplified approach where I simply do not have the finally scope. So this flow does exactly the same thing, except it only sends me an email inside the main scope. And well, it could be called try and catch, but in my case, this is main and exception, same thing. But basically, it will send the email in here. If anything fails, this email will not be sent. And that's perfectly fine because, yeah, I only want the recommendations. If I actually fail to fetch them, there's no point in having that email. And then I can simplify the body in here. I can simplify the logic because I don't need to check whether or not these actions actually failed. I still have an expression in here, but that's just because I wanted a nicely formatted HTML that actually checks whether or not the select actually has any outputs. So, and then inside the exception, most of this is almost the same. In this case, I don't send myself an email, but I log it. That's also a child flow, show you in a minute. And I finally can actually use a terminate action to stop the flow on an exception. And what this means is that if I run this flow and fails, I'll see it as a failed flow run in the flow run history. Now, yeah, I'll show you what that looks like in a sec, but just before that, the child flow for logging is very simple. So I've got actually a couple for the testing purposes. There's one that logs to a Dataverse and one that logs to SharePoint, but they both look pretty much the same. It's very simple. You could obviously put in more logic in there and whatever, but in my case, it's just a manual trigger with some inputs, a new entry in a Dataverse table, and just a blank response. So again, just putting it in here so that if I ever want to change the way we log, I change it in a single child flow, and that basically gets rolled out to all the flows using it instead of having to do it in every single flow. So if I run a test, and I think I have a, oh right, yeah. So there's flow resubmissions. You keep forgetting that. So test that manually. Right, so if I run this test, I've specifically made this flow fail because it has a filter on a column that doesn't exist in my SharePoint list. So I specifically made it fail, and what then happens is, I get a message logged in the Dataverse table, and this is the table. What this will look like, I might need to refresh it. Right, and I have the message itself that was parsed and generated by the child flow. Looks like this. The column true does not exist. That's the one I specifically put in. Now that's actually an incorrect syntax for the filter in general. And then it shows up like this with the URL. So if I click this URL, I'm taken to the specific flow run that opens up in the classic designer for some reason. Right, and that's where I can see the issue. And again, as you can see, when it's a container, the error in a container looks like this. So if I had a nested container with an action that failed, that's what the result would fetch. That's why we actually need to target each individual container with the result expression to fetch the outputs of the specific action. And that's where we get the error. That's this error that gets logged properly in the message. Right. And well, it also shows up as failed, thankfully, because then at least it's also easier to find them in here. Right. Now, a slightly more advanced approach is for cases when you actually have a loop. Now, if you have a loop, and that's, well, not necessarily nested, but for example, if it's nested inside your container, in most cases, you would not want to stop your entire flow if you're processing a multitude of items. Right, so you would usually, in most business scenarios, want to just skip the one item that failed and then continue processing further items, because that maybe it's just one problematic item, and you want to, but you want to still complete. So in cases like that, what you need to do is basically you need to put in the actual exception handling inside the loop, so that the item itself is handled by individual exception handling, whereas whatever is outside of the loop has its own native exception handling for itself. Now, this could just be pushed to a child flow. That's also a very valid approach, and usually used as child flow. So the entire thing with its own scope, with its own trigger, and so on, and a response, and the actual exception scope would just be in a child flow, and it would just respond back. But it can also be done like this, where you just basically have all of your normal actions inside of the loop in a container, and then you have exception handling for that container. And it looks almost the same, except that you wouldn't terminate, because, well, first of all, you can't terminate inside a loop even if you want to. But again, even if it was possible, that's not the intention. because we want to continue even if a single item fails. So if there is a single item failing in this case, the flow run will still show up as a successful run, and only if any of the actions outside the loop fail, then we would this exception block would kick in, and then it would be terminated. So in this particular scenario, I'm actually fetching cocktails, again, favorite cocktails, and then for each of them, I'm also fetching ingredients basically for that specific cocktail and checking whether they're available or not. And if I have all of the available ingredients for my cocktail, then I'll send them all in an email saying that, yeah, okay, you can make one of these because you've got everything. And I specifically put in this expression over there just to make one of the items fail. That's the way I tested the whole thing. That's not necessary, normally that wouldn't be there, but just for the purpose of making one item fail without all of them failing, that's there. So what this will look like and what I'll be able to show you, oh, sorry about that. I'm gonna try to show you an sample email of what this generates. Right, so yeah, it just recommended that I could make, okay, well, I'm short on, seems like I'm short on ingredients for a Mai Tai, but at least I can make a B52 and a gin and tonic at home. And then one of these items failed. All right. So this failure, it couldn't retrieve the ingredients. That's maybe actually the Mai Tai, and that's why I didn't get a recommendation for it. And then I got, let's check where I was logging this. Doesn't want to expand.
Someone just mentioned, can we get these 2/3 flows for reference? I don't know if that means.
Yeah, well, I'll come back to that just a sec.
Yeah, thanks, Agnes.
So I log that to item expression. Okay, so it basically logged this try doesn't exist because again that's the specific exception I forced on it, and it got logged. And I assume it was either logged to my SharePoint site. That's just another potential way to log them, and that's over here, I think. Yep. Or to a Dataverse table. That's just some of the options on where you could log them. And basically this pops up in the log messages, but the flow itself seems as if it succeeded because everything else actually succeeded, and I actually received my recommendations. Right, and the final approach that I want to show you is in some more advanced cases when you actually want to continue the flow if something fails, but you're going to have different error handling rules for different steps inside the flow. Right? So in this particular case, I've got a case where I'm getting my cocktails and filtering them, and then just generating a random number. And for that random number, I'm gonna try to fetch the cocktail, the random cocktail, basically from those filtered. Then I'm gonna get the ingredients and check if I've got all of them. Now, if the initial bit fails, where I'm just getting all of my data, then I'm just essentially going to parse the error. I'm going to send myself a team message that it failed, and I'm going to terminate. But if this bit succeeds, when I've successfully fetched the cocktails, but something else failed in here, then I've got almost the same rules over here, except I'm also going to update the item and gonna make it flagged as unavailable, meaning that, yeah, there's something wrong with it, probably with the ingredients of it or something, and that's why I can't make this this cocktail. So it's no longer being fetched, so it doesn't fail next time. And that's again a potential approach for cases when you're actually fetching items, that could maybe lead to one type of exception handling, whereas then you're processing items, and as you process them, you might want to handle them slightly differently. So in those cases, you're making a parallel branch where the default flow is when this container succeeds, whereas the alternative flow is for an exception, basically when it fails or gets timed out. And in this particular case, oh, sorry, that's not the right button I was going to click. I'm gonna just run it. So obviously I'm forcing it to fail again, just for the purpose of the demo. And when it has failed, I receive a Teams message that says flow has failed. Again, another column doesn't exist, and that's why it couldn't complete the whole task. And it failed in run. So it basically succeeded with the first initial set, but it failed to get ingredients because the column that I added as a filter for the ingredients list wasn't found. And that's when this exception block kicked in. And that's basically the approaches, the different approaches. And the idea of it is, well, yeah, I'll switch back to the slides briefly to give you a few key takeaways. So essentially, when you're thinking of handling errors in Cloudflows, the important thing and the recommended thing is to use the result expression on containers, and basically grouping your actions inside containers so that they can be handled via result instead of handling actions, because then your flows will get huge and messy. Now, and then I would recommend wrapping the entire flow, or at least as much as you can, into a scope, like a main or a try or something, and handle that. But try to have minimum nesting, avoid it if possible. But if you absolutely have to have nesting, you'll need to actually handle that, the exceptions of each of those nested containers at container level. So if you, for example, have a condition inside your scope, you'll need to adjust your result expression to actually target both of those, both of the main and the condition. If you have a loop, you may want to actually handle individual items instead of the entire loop so that your flow doesn't stop just because a single item has failed. Then send an email or a Teams message or whatever with the error details, or at least log it. Usually my recommendation is to always log stuff and then also send a notification if necessary, if the flow is urgent, or if the whatever process owners want it or something like that. If there is logs, you don't absolutely need to send notifications. If there are no logs, then you absolutely should send notifications, especially if those flows run on service accounts where you won't really be notified right away anyway. And then after you've handled the error, if the exception actually meant that the entire error flow has actually failed to complete, it's not just a single item, but the flow itself, then terminate with an error message after handling so that you can actually see it in action and in the flow run history as a failed flow run. Right. Now, there's the expressions I used. This should be available in the slide. I'm not really sure if the slides are being shared by default, but if you want to, I can easily share them.
Yeah,
but
Agnes, if you want, you can share your slides with me afterwards, and then I'll put them underneath the recording, and people can see.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll share the slides so you can actually pick out the expressions. So this is the one to generate an XML. This may need to be modified based on the naming of your containers, but also, if you have more than one, and actually need to show that in one of the flows. I'll just switch back to the demo in a sec. This is for getting the error details. So this is basically static. You don't need to modify this. This works with and as long as this XML actually fetches the results of all of your containers, then this will work on any of those XMLs. So it can actually be moved out to a child flow. And then this is for getting the flow run URL. You actually need to use this inside your flow, the one that you're actually handling. So it can be moved out, but it's also static. So it will always fetch the correct environment and the correct flow ID and the flow run ID as well. So that's a very cool and useful expression. And I'll just try to switch back and quickly show you what it would look like if we have nested containers. Back. So no, that's the one that I was actually already showing you. Give me a sec. Okay. Right, so in this case, I've got the process item scope, and I've actually got a condition inside it, so that's a nested container. It's unlikely that an append to array action would actually ever fail, but for the fullness of it, actually build this. So this is what it would look like if you actually have two containers to handle. What is actually required in an XML expression is that you pass in a JSON object that only has a single root item and it's not an array. So you can't really, you actually need to build in this sort of a structure where you've got one root item and that root item has child objects as the actual results of each of your container handler. So this is what it would look like, for example, if you needed to handle multiple containers. Right. And now before I actually wrap up, there's one more thing I wanted to quickly mention, and that's the alternative way, which is, well, it doesn't really kind of object the entire thing, everything I've just shown you, but it's a cool new thing that's, well, relatively new, and that's the so-called flow run table in Dataverse. So for all of your Dataverse flows, basically solution-aware flows, whenever they actually execute, you'll get an entry created in this flow run table in Dataverse. And this entry, well, it just has the retention span of the flow run history, so 28 days. But what you'll get is an entry, and if it actually failed, if a flow failed, you'll see that it actually has the error message as well with the status. And it will contain the flow run ID, which can be used to actually generate the flow run URL as well. And there's statuses, there's plenty of other fields as well that could potentially be useful. So what we could actually do is we could build a flow, for example, that just kind of runs a maintenance flow or something at an environment level that would basically just kind of react to any flow failing and basically a failed flow run entry being created in this table, and then do something about it, like sending a notification to someone or something like that. And that would make it possible to kind of have some error handling or reporting at least, without building all of those actions I've just shown you into each of your flows. Now, this is cool and works with most of the simple flows where we actually are okay with the flow stopping after the first error. So with the most basic exception handling, it's kind of okay-ish. It's great for citizen developer initiatives where they might not be aware of the fact that they need to build in any error handling. So we can, a more advanced developer could just build a flow that does this and just does some reporting or something like that. It's also useful for analytics, but it would still not replace anything in a more advanced sequence, like having a loop or in cases where you actually want to have different exception handling based on the step in which your flow failed. And on top of that, this is actually an elastic table, meaning that if you're close to or run out of Dataverse capacity in your tenant, this will not be prioritized, so you may not be getting your flow run information in there. So yeah, that's not something I would usually recommend to use in actual enterprise environments. And since it does have the retention span of 28 days, I would usually recommend to have your logs also kind of moved somewhere else where you can actually have them for longer, especially if you use them for analytics. But a great addition helps us handle a vast majority of very simple flows and handling for them. Right. And that's the end of my session. If you feel like you like this, and if you want to follow me or connect with me on LinkedIn, feel free to find me there. And I would also really appreciate it if you took a couple of minutes to rate my session. This QR code will take you to a forum that just has a couple of questions. This is a purely voluntary session, so I'd appreciate any feedback as long as it's constructive. I appreciate both positive and negative feedback. That's that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Agnes, for a great presentation demos. So we'll now get into the questions and answers part. Should you wish to ask a question, please feel free to type in the questions box now. So our first question is, I have an instant flow called from Power Apps that needs data from SharePoint and sends it by email. It sometimes fails for users with an error like the refresh token has expired. Then I try to handle the error by getting it to send an email to support and the failed action. The fails too, as it is trying to use the same user account to send the email. Any suggestions? Can I force the emails to the support action to run under another account?
Yeah, well, it could, but I would assume that if a token expires, this probably means that the flow is not used very frequently. Or well, the connection that the flow uses is probably used rarely, and that's what causes the token to expire. Because normally when they're used frequently, every run actually refreshes the tokens, so they're kept alive. But they might expire within some days, like 60 or 90 days after not being used. So if you run your flows rarely and if you don't use those connections outside of this particular flow, that's what usually causes the issue itself, if you wanted to solve this, for example. Other than that, what you would want then, I guess, you could just have a because basically when you have a flow and you have different actions, there's one action that would send the email, right? That's the normal one on the happy path. Then inside your exception handling, you'd have a separate action that sends an email to support. And so this action could use a different connection reference or a connection that depends on whether that's a solution aware flow or not. So because you define the connection to be used at an action level, so you can have different connections used, well, different mailbox connections used in the two different actions inside your flow, and assuming that this other connection for sending the support emails actually gets used more frequently, it would not get the issue with the token expiring. So that could solve your problem. Or alternatively, you could just maybe have a sort of a maintenance flow that just kind of runs at some frequency, like every week or so, that just kind of uses those same connections just for fetching some items, just basically mimicking an API request, not doing much with it, just maybe getting emails or getting the SharePoint items from a list or something. If you do that at a certain frequency, then your tokens won't expire. And then when you actually want to run that flow from your app, it will work. So those are the approaches I would take.
Perfect. So just next question there is, traditionally the finally block was primarily used to close any connections left open, in brackets, like database connections, for example. As you said, it's not very often that you would need to do something like that in these flows.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a question. That's more like a statement.
Yeah.
And yeah, I agree. Yes, it doesn't make much sense, but I've seen those still recommended. I've seen videos online on recommendations and doing that as well. I just couldn't really find a feasible use case in any of my clients or internal flows. So that's why, I kind of had an honorable mention for it. Just also explained why I don't think it makes much sense.
Perfect. So this next question there is, let's say we're implementing a solution at multiple customers. We'd like to receive and process errors in our own tenant. How would you implement this?
Right. So, well, I do that with by basically sending out those errors to my own. Well, because we also do that, obviously, for our clients. If the client agrees with this, we send out errors via an API request to our Elk stack, which is Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. So basically, we send it to our Logstash API server via an API request, so that we can then monitor it using Elasticsearch and Kibana. That's the way we do it. But obviously, the client needs to agree with this, and those who do not agree, then we kind of have to do the monitoring on their own tenant. So it's you kind of need to verify this with them first, and if they're okay, then you can just use whatever means you want to wherever you want to store those. It could also be a SQL Server database or something like that. It just needs to be something that you can actually secure in a way that there's no way for the client to kind of exploit it and kind of push too many entries into your databases or servers. Could have an intermediary server or something like that. It just kind of needs a bit of tweaking around and finding the best balance and the best thing that works best for you. We found that Elk works great for combining the logs and of multiple clients and having proper monitoring in our case. But yeah, it also needs some implementation, and you need to know how to actually build it out.
Perfect. So this next question there is, the actions of initializing variables cannot be added to scope in cases where there are many variables to be declared. The beginning part of the flow is dominated by a series of initialization actions. What's the best way of dealing with it?
Yeah, so I don't personally like the fact that initialize variable cannot be a part of the scope. Yeah, I don't like that idea, obviously, because of this reason. But generally, I would also try to avoid having a lot of variables initialized. If you need a lot of variables, then just use a single object and put them all in, a single JSON object with all of the variables inside it. Initialize one variable and then parse it out, and then use the parameters from inside it. That's the way I do it. On top of that, we frequently use externally stored configuration. So we basically have a config table somewhere, like in database, in a database, or in Dataverse, or even SharePoint for non-premium flows. And we would just basically read that out when the flow starts. That's a different topic. I won't really delve deeper into it because that's a full hour session on how to implement that. But that's also a way, if you actually need a lot of variables, and especially if you sometimes need to edit them, it's a good idea to store them externally instead of having them initialized inside the flow itself, because whenever you need to modify them, you then also need to modify the flow. But yeah, so for the cases where you actually want to initialize them inside a flow, I'd initialize a single object with all of the variables as parameters inside it, and then I'd parse it using parse JSON and get that available to further action.
Perfect. So the next question there is, what's the benefit of using child flows to process errors?
So the benefit of using child flows is basically reusability. So we have, I assume that this is for the child flows I've shown you in the exception block, that parsing the error or sending an email or logging and something like that. So it's about reusability. It means that if we ever need to change something about it, so for example, if at some point I find that I want to change that clunky expression that I used to parse the error messages because maybe for some reason something changes, maybe I find another funky connector that returns the errors somehow differently from all the others, then I change it in the child flow, and then the changes get rolled out automatically to all of the parents that actually call it. So I don't need to go through every single flow in my tenant to actually modify them. And then that also applies to logging, for example. So okay, I might be cool with logging to a SharePoint list initially if I'm non-premium flows in a small scale. But then as we grow and if we switch to actually using premium, I would usually prefer using Dataverse for logging instead of SharePoint. And I just change that in the child flow, and I wouldn't need to change the way we log in all of our flows and also go through all of them to verify that I've changed it everywhere, so that I know that all of our logs actually reside in that one place. Same applies to reporting. So I've shown you a few ways in which they could be reported. I've sent an email, I've sent a Teams message to myself, and so on. This could also be a child flow, and we just basically decide on whether or not, what we do, basically. So this depends a bit on whether we actually want a full-on same policy for reporting all flows, or we actually want some custom rules per flow. So that's why I didn't really put that out into a child flow, but it could also be a child flow as well. Mainly reusability, the ease of maintenance and modifications.
Perfect. So that's all the time we have for today, but it's okay if people who have questions, could they message you on LinkedIn? That's okay, Agnes.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Perfect. So on behalf of the ESPC community, we'd like to extend a big thank you to you again, Agnes, for taking time out today to carry out this webinar. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun. I hope it was useful.
Yes, so that's the end of today's webinar. You can find this webinar at more at sharepointeurope.com/resource center. Thanks again to all of you for joining us today, and I hope you join us again soon. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.